Greetings, Grace. Welcome back to our series on cover to cover through the whole Bible. Today we're finishing up in the book of Leviticus and carrying on to the book of Numbers. Forgive me as I read from my notes. As I go through all this, I found that I'm a little less long-winded when I do. So let's begin. What exactly is going on in Leviticus 27? So first off, the Bible is a literary work. And two things are happening simultaneously here. First, as we mentioned in previous discussions, Leviticus has a literary place in the Torah. The book of Exodus ends with the enthronement of God as the king of Israel, and it concludes with the statement that Moses could not enter the tent of meeting. But when we get to Numbers, it begins with the statement, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. Leviticus is telling us how we have communion with God. Literally, the whole book of Leviticus is explaining how the community approached a holy God who is enthroned among the community. The next thing that's happening is something called chiasm, or chiasm, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Pastor Steve has talked at length about Hebrew poetry and its use of parallelism. One form of parallelism is called chiasm or chiasmus or chiasm, and the book of Leviticus has a literary structure that follows what we would call a chiastic pattern. In chiasm, the main point of a poem or a literary work is in the middle, and then the parallel structures are just kind of along the outside. So the very beginning and the very end line up, and then everything works towards the center, and then the main point is right there in the very middle. What this means is that the main point of Leviticus, as we mentioned in yesterday's talk, is the middle section of the book, which is the Yom Kippur ritual and the Day of Atonement. And what that means is that the closing chapters of Leviticus parallel with the opening chapters of Leviticus. When we look at those, we see that the book concludes in the same way that it opens, with a chapter on sanctuary regulations and contributions for the upkeep of the sanctuary. Chapter 27, some commentators describe it as a latch that closes the book by locking onto the beginning. So Leviticus 27 is an extension also of chapters 25 and 26. The Jubilee system and the role of the kinsman redeemer were economic policies designed to establish God's justice and righteousness in every sphere of life. Leviticus 27 is an extension of this notion of economic justice, in which the normal everyday matters of life can be dedicated to God. It's an extension of what we find throughout the Torah, in which ordinary objects become sanctified, and to sanctify something is to translate it from the realm of the ordinary into the realm of the sacred. And so that's what's taking place in this valuation of Leviticus 27. So what about Numbers 1? Well, keeping in mind, once again, that the Bible is a literary work, Numbers 1 is another boring list of names. No, it's actually doing some pretty heavy lifting here. First, just like we notice, Numbers begins with those words, and the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. On the first day of the second month of the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So recall that Exodus ends with that statement that Moses could not enter the tent. The book of Leviticus becomes a sort of parenthesis between Exodus 40 and Numbers 1. Moses couldn't enter the tent, and Leviticus shows us how Moses was able to enter. When Numbers 1 opens, we see the Levitical system. We see that the Levitical system worked. Israel is able to approach God, and that's what's taking place when Moses enters the tent of meeting. Next, you'll see that Numbers 1 gives us a specific date. It says the first day of the second month of the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. In Exodus 40, verse 17, we read, "So the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month in the second year. and that's exactly 1 month earlier. So chronologically, Numbers is picking up where Exodus left off. So just like Leviticus, Numbers will begin and end with a common theme. And in this case, it begins and ends with a census. The book is asking us to compare these two censuses. So if you compare Numbers 1 and the censuses that take place there with the censuses that take place at the end of Numbers, we're going to look at it. We're going to see some differences going on. The census is a counting of all the fighting men. This is a preparation for war. And so Numbers is the setup, is God has amassed his people, and he actually intends to march them straight into the promised land. And what takes place instead is 40 years of wandering in the desert. And Numbers is kind of explaining, why didn't they go straight into the promised land? If you remember yesterday's, part of that explanation is that it's walking us through those blessings, curses, and restoration that we talked about in Leviticus chapters 26, that we're going to see this whole pattern unfold throughout the book of Numbers. The book is going to cover a period of many years in which an entire generation passes away in the wilderness, and a new generation is going to be poised to enter the promised land. Spoiler alert, the population drops. And so the people who enter the promised land at the end are fewer than the people who left Egypt and who God originally wanted to take into the promised land. Finally, the last chapter of Leviticus included the sections of blessing and curses and restoration. As we continue through the book of Numbers, we'll be exposed to a cycle of disobedience in which the Israelite community follows that pattern, beginning with blessing, continuing in disobedience, and culminating in restoration. And so that's what's going on between Leviticus 27, 26, 25, all the way into Numbers 1.